6 Messerschmitt 109 circle above like vultures, altitude 22,000 feet, closing fast. The radio crackles with panic from B-17 formations below. Bandits, bandits. High 12 o'clock. Second Lieutenant Tommy Morrison checks his fuel gauge, counts his ammunition, calculates the odds. 6 versus 1. No wingman. No backup. His squadron commander's voice echoes in his memory. That maneuver will get you killed, Morrison. The lead Messerschmitt rolls into its attack dive. Morrison doesn't brake, doesn't climb, doesn't run. Instead, he does something that violates every principle of fighter doctrine. He cuts his throttle to idle, pulls his nose vertical, and lets his Mustang fall backward through the sky like a stone. The Germans flash past at 400 miles per hour, committed, helpless, suddenly transformed from hunters into targets. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What happens in the next 90 seconds will rewrite fighter tactics forever. Western France, September 1943. The autumn sky above Normandy is deceptive. From 25,000 feet, the countryside looks peaceful. Golden fields stretch toward the horizon. Villages cluster around church spires. But this is occupied territory. Every field holds listening posts. Every village has German troops. And somewhere in that peaceful landscape, Luftwaffe bases scramble fighters to intercept the Allied bomber streams crossing toward Germany. The strategic situation is brutal. The 8th Air Force is bleeding planes and crews daily. B-17 formations limping home with engines smoking, wings shredded, men dead at their stations. The bombers need escorts all the way to the target and back. The P-51 Mustang was designed for that mission. Long range, high altitude, enough firepower to challenge anything the Germans could field. But range and firepower mean nothing if the pilot doesn't survive the first engagement. Fighter doctrine in 1943 is simple, aggressive, and often fatal. Close with the enemy and destroy him. Speed is life. Altitude is insurance. When German fighters attack, you turn into them. Climb if you can, dive if you must. Never give up the initiative. Never let them dictate the terms of the fight. The problem is that doctrine assumes your enemy follows the same rules. German pilots in the autumn of 1943 are experienced, disciplined, and desperate. They know American production is outpacing German losses. They know time is running short. So they fight with calculated ferocity, using tactics refined over 4 years of war. They bait American fighters into turning fights. They exploit altitude advantages. They coordinate attacks with ruthless precision. American fighter pilots are trained to be aggressive. But aggression without calculation becomes recklessness. Recklessness gets you killed. The loss rates reflect this mathematics. In some bomber groups, fighter escorts last an average of 7 missions. 7 missions before death, injury, or capture. The survivors share certain traits. They think before they react. They calculate before they commit. They understand that courage without intelligence is just a faster way to die. At RAF Boxstead in Essex, the 357th Fighter Group is learning these lessons the hard way. Second Lieutenant Thomas Morrison doesn't look like a fighter pilot. At 19, he's thin, pale, with hands that seem too large for his wrists. He grew up in Amarillo, Texas, where his father worked for the Santa Fe Railway and his mother taught piano lessons in their front parlor. The sound of train whistles and Bach inventions defined his childhood. Tommy learned to fly before he learned to drive. His father took him to the local airfield when he was 14, thinking the boy might enjoy watching the crop dusters. Instead, Tommy befriended the mechanics. He studied how they adjusted engine timing, how they balanced control surfaces, how they calculated weight and balance for different loads. By 16, he was working weekends in exchange for flight instruction. He wasn't a natural pilot. His first instructor noted that he overthought every maneuver, asked too many questions, wanted to understand the physics behind every procedure. But he was precise. When he practiced stalls, he could repeat the exact same altitude loss 3 times in a row. When he practiced turns, his bank angles were mathematically consistent. The attack on Pearl Harbor changed everything. Tommy enlisted in the Army Air Forces in January 1942, motivated not by patriotism, but by opportunity. The military needed pilots. The military had airplanes. The military offered the fastest path from small-town obscurity to something that mattered. Primary flight training in Texas revealed Tommy's peculiar approach to combat aviation. While other cadets practiced aggressive tactics, he studied energy management. While they competed for the fastest times in training exercises, he calculated the most efficient solutions. His instructors found this analytical approach unusual but effective. He graduated in the top 15% of his class. Advanced training in Arizona introduced him to the P-51 Warhawk, an older fighter that taught hard lessons about energy conservation. Tommy learned that speed was currency. You spent it to climb or turn. You earned it back through diving or acceleration. Every maneuver had a cost. Every decision had consequences. But it was during gunnery training that Tommy discovered something that would define his combat approach. The standard method for deflection shooting involved instinct and experience. Pilots learned to feel the correct lead angle. They practiced until muscle memory guided their aim. Tommy approached it differently. He calculated lead angles using basic trigonometry. He measured closure rates and angular velocities. He built mathematical models for different engagement scenarios. His instructors thought it was excessive, academic, impractical for the split-second decisions required in combat. Until he started hitting targets other pilots missed. If stories like this matter to you, like and subscribe so these voices aren't forgotten. By the time Tommy reached England in August 1943, he developed a theory about fighter combat that contradicted everything the Air Force taught. He believed most engagements were won or lost before the first shot was fired. Positioning, energy management, and timing mattered more than pure aggression. The pilot who controlled the initial engagement conditions controlled the outcome. He kept this theory to himself. His squadron mates at Boxstead were veterans of North Africa and Sicily. They'd learned combat flying against experienced German pilots. They knew what worked and what didn't. They weren't interested in theories from a 19-year-old replacement pilot who'd never fired his guns in anger. Tommy's first combat mission was a milk run. Escort duty for B-24s hitting submarine pins in Norway. High altitude, no enemy contact, perfect weather. He stayed in formation, followed orders, and returned to base without incident. His squadron commander, Major Frank Gabreski, noted that the kid was disciplined, calm, and precise in his flying. Good traits for a wingman. His second mission was different. They ran into a swarm of Focke-Wulf 190s over the Netherlands. The formation scattered. Tommy found himself alone, separated from his element leader, with two Germans closing from his 6 o'clock position. He followed doctrine. He turned into them, forcing a head-on pass. Both sides fired and missed. The Germans broke away, then regrouped for another attack. Tommy had perhaps 30 seconds to decide his next move. He did something his instructors never taught him. Something that violated every principle of fighter tactics. Something that should have gotten him killed. Fighter combat in 1943 follows predictable patterns. German pilots, particularly those flying the latest Focke-Wulf 190s, exploit specific American weaknesses. They bait P-51 pilots into turning fights where the heavier German aircraft can use superior roll rates and firepower. They use altitude advantages to control engagement timing. They coordinate attacks to overwhelm individual American fighters. The mathematics are unforgiving. A P-51 Mustang at 300 miles per hour in a sustained turn bleeds energy at a predictable rate. German pilots know this. They can calculate how long an American fighter can maintain defensive maneuvers before becoming vulnerable. The average engagement lasts between 45 seconds and 2 minutes. The pilot who retains the most energy at the end of that time window usually survives. American doctrine emphasizes aggression and speed. Close with the enemy. Maintain offensive pressure. Use the P-51's superior range and high-altitude performance to dominate the engagement envelope. This works when American pilots have numerical or positional advantages. It fails catastrophically when they don't. The 357th Fighter Group's loss rates reflect these tactical realities. In August 1943, they lost 4 pilots in 5 missions. 2 were shot down by fighters. 1 collided with another American aircraft during a dogfight. 1 simply disappeared, probably victim to unknown ground fire or mechanical failure. Major Gabreski studies these losses methodically. He interviews survivors. He examines gun camera footage. He reads German tactical manuals captured by intelligence officers. A pattern emerges. American pilots are dying because they're fighting German fights on German terms. The problem is structural. Fighter pilots are selected for aggression, competitiveness, and quick reflexes. These traits serve them well in most combat situations. But they become liabilities when facing experienced opponents who can manipulate American aggression against itself. German fighter pilots in late 1943 are not the same men who flew over Britain in 1940. They're older, more experienced, more calculating. They've survived years of combat by learning to think tactically. They use formation discipline, coordinated attacks, and energy management as weapons. They don't rely on individual heroics. American replacement pilots arriving in England often possess superior individual flying skills, but lack tactical sophistication. They can outfly most German pilots in basic maneuvers. They can't outthink them in complex engagement scenarios. This creates a tactical mismatch that costs lives. Young American pilots with 200 hours of flight time engage German veterans with 2,000 hours of combat experience. The outcome is often predetermined. The solution requires rethinking fundamental assumptions about fighter combat. It requires pilots who can calculate as well as react. It requires tactical innovations that exploit American advantages while minimizing vulnerabilities. It requires someone willing to break the rules. Tommy Morrison's unorthodox approach to fighter combat began during his second mission, alone over the Netherlands with two Focke-Wulf 190s closing for the kill. Standard doctrine demanded aggression. Turn into them. Force head-on passes. Maintain offensive pressure. Instead, Tommy did something that violated every principle he'd been taught. He cut his throttle to idle and pulled his nose vertical. The P-51 Mustang, suddenly deprived of thrust, decelerated rapidly. From 320 miles per hour to 280 to 240. The pursuing Germans, committed to their attack at full throttle, found themselves in an impossible position. They were closing too fast to adjust their aim. Too fast to match Tommy's sudden maneuver. Too fast to avoid overshooting their target. Tommy watched them flash past. Helpless, their aircraft committed to high-speed flight, while his Mustang hung almost motionless at the top of its vertical climb. For perhaps 3 seconds, he had perfect firing opportunities at point-blank range. He shot down both German fighters before they could react. Back at Boxstead, Tommy described the engagement during his debriefing. The intelligence officer took notes, asked clarifying questions, filed the report. Tommy's squadron mates congratulated him on his first kills, bought him drinks at the officers' club, and promptly forgot the details of how he'd achieved them. But Tommy didn't forget. He'd discovered something profound about the physics of air combat. Speed wasn't always life. Sometimes, the deliberate sacrifice of speed could become the ultimate weapon. The concept violated everything fighter pilots believed. Speed equals energy. Energy equals options. Giving up speed meant giving up the ability to maneuver, climb, or escape. In every combat scenario taught in training, the slower aircraft was the dead aircraft. Tommy realized this assumption contained a critical flaw. It was true when both aircraft maintained similar energy states. It became false when one pilot deliberately created a radical energy differential. He began developing what he privately called the stall fight technique. The idea was counterintuitive. Instead of maintaining speed during defensive maneuvers, a pilot could deliberately bleed energy to create firing opportunities. The key was timing. The maneuver had to be initiated when pursuing aircraft were committed to high-speed attacks. The physics were elegant in their simplicity. A fighter pursuing at 400 miles per hour needed approximately 1,200 feet to complete a 180-degree turn at 4gs. A fighter decelerating through controlled stall maneuvers could change direction in less than 300 feet. This differential created what Tommy called angular advantage windows, brief periods when the slower aircraft could outturn its pursuer despite having less total energy. Tommy tested his theory during training flights, practicing controlled stalls, studying stall recovery procedures, learning to manipulate his aircraft's energy state with precision. He discovered that the P-51's specific flight characteristics made it ideal for this type of maneuvering. The Mustang had excellent stall characteristics, predictable recovery behavior, and sufficient power-to-weight ratio to regain energy quickly after deliberate energy expenditure. His squadron mates noticed his unusual training methods. They watched him practice what looked like aerobatic maneuvers rather than combat tactics. Some joked that he was training for an air show rather than war. Others suggested he was wasting time on impractical maneuvers that had no combat application. Major Gabreski observed one of these training sessions and asked Tommy to explain what he was doing. Tommy described his energy management theory, his stall fight technique, and his mathematical approach to engagement geometry. Gabreski listened carefully, asked technical questions, then told Tommy to demonstrate the maneuver. Tommy complied. He climbed to 10,000 feet, accelerated to 350 miles per hour, then pulled vertical and cut his throttle. The Mustang decelerated rapidly, reached the top of its climb at near stall speed, then fell backward in a controlled tailslide before recovering to normal flight. Gabreski was impressed by the precision but concerned about the implications. He pointed out that the maneuver left Tommy vulnerable to any other German fighters in the area. If Tommy misjudged the timing, if his engine failed to restart properly, if he encountered multiple attackers, the technique could prove fatal. Tommy acknowledged these risks but argued that the tactical advantages outweighed them. The maneuver was designed for specific engagement scenarios, when outnumbered, when caught at a disadvantage, when conventional tactics offered little chance of survival. Gabreski told him to keep practicing but warned him not to attempt it in combat without explicit authorization. The technique was too dangerous, too unproven, too likely to result in the loss of an aircraft and pilot. Tommy agreed. Then, 3 weeks later, he found himself in exactly the situation where conventional tactics offered no hope of survival. September 14, 1943. The briefing at Boxstead begins before dawn. Intelligence officers pull back curtains to reveal a map of Western Germany marked with red yarn. The target, aircraft factories at Regensburg, more than 600 miles from England, beyond the range of escort fighters for most of the journey. The bomber stream will be vulnerable, exposed, dependent on their own defensive firepower. The 357th Fighter Group's mission is limited escort for the first 150 miles. They'll accompany the bombers to the edge of German fighter range, then turn back while the B-17s continue alone into what everyone knows will be a slaughter. Major Gabreski assigns Tommy Morrison to fly as Tail End Charlie, the last aircraft in the formation, responsible for watching behind the group for German fighters attempting to attack from the 6 o'clock position. It's a critical but lonely assignment. Tail End Charlie flies alone, separated from the main formation, vulnerable if attacked. Tommy checks his P-51 thoroughly during pre-flight. Fuel, 489 gallons internal, maximum range. Ammunition, 1,260 rounds of .50 caliber, sufficient for perhaps 30 seconds of continuous fire. Engine, running smoothly, oil pressure good, temperatures normal. The aircraft is ready. The question is whether he'll need to use what he's been practicing. Takeoff is routine. The formation assembles over England in the gray pre-dawn light. 52 P-51 Mustangs climbing through cloud layers, finding their positions, organizing into the combat formation that will escort 300 B-17 flying fortresses deep into German-controlled airspace. Tommy takes his position 2,000 feet behind and slightly above the main group. From this vantage point, he can see the entire formation spread across miles of sky. The bombers are magnificent and ominous. Dark crosses against white clouds, carrying 10 men each, laden with high explosives, flying steadily toward targets defended by hundreds of German fighters. The flight across the English Channel is peaceful. Morning sunlight breaks through cloud layers. The formation maintains strict radio discipline. Below, the white cliffs of Dover disappear behind them. Ahead lies occupied Europe. German radar picks them up before they reach the French coast. Tommy knows this because he studied German defensive procedures. Somewhere in concrete bunkers, Luftwaffe controllers are plotting the incoming formation, calculating headings and speeds, scrambling fighters from bases across northern France. The first attack comes over the Netherlands. Tommy spots them first, 12 dark specks climbing from the east, still 10 miles away but closing fast. He calls them out over the radio. Bandits, 2 o'clock high, 12 plus, Angels 25. Major Gabreski acknowledges and begins turning the formation to meet the threat. This is standard procedure. Present the enemy with the maximum number of guns. Force them to attack through concentrated firepower. But Tommy notices something wrong. These German fighters aren't behaving normally. They're climbing too slowly, approaching too directly. Real German fighters would use altitude advantages, coordinate their attacks, exploit numerical superiority. These 12 aircraft are acting like decoys. He scans the sky systematically, sector by sector, looking for the real threat. There. 6 o'clock low, perhaps 3 miles back, climbing steadily. 6 Messerschmitt 109s using the decoy formation as distraction while they position for a surprise attack on the bomber stream's tail. Tommy faces an impossible choice. He can break radio silence to warn the formation, alerting the Germans that they've been spotted. He can abandon his position to engage the climbing fighters, leaving the formation's rear unprotected. Or he can maintain position and hope the main formation handles both threats simultaneously. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. He chooses a fourth option. He'll engage the real threat alone. Tommy banks left and descends toward the climbing Messerschmitts. His airspeed builds. 350 miles per hour, 380, 400. The Germans see him coming but continue their climb toward the bombers. They're committed to their attack plan. They'll deal with the single American fighter afterward. Tommy counts aircraft and calculates odds. 6 versus 1. No wingman. No support. If he survives the initial engagement, he'll face 5 experienced German pilots with superior position and altitude advantage. Conventional tactics offer virtually no chance of survival. Time to test his theory. The lead Messerschmitt opens fire at 800 yards, too far for accurate shooting, but close enough to force Tommy into defensive maneuvers. Tommy doesn't turn. He doesn't dive. He doesn't follow any procedure taught in fighter school. Instead, he pulls back on the stick and cuts his throttle to idle. The P-51 Mustang's nose comes up sharply, pointing almost straight up. The aircraft begins to decelerate rapidly as gravity and drag overcome thrust. 380 miles per hour, 320. 280. The 6 German fighters, committed to their high-speed attack, suddenly face an impossible problem. Their target has disappeared from their engagement envelope. The lead Messerschmitt flashes past Tommy's position at 450 miles per hour, firing wildly, unable to adjust for the sudden change in target motion. The second follows, then the third. All 6 German fighters are now below Tommy's position, moving too fast to turn effectively, committed to straight-line flight for the next several seconds. Tommy's Mustang hangs almost motionless at the top of its ballistic arc. His airspeed has dropped to 120 miles per hour, barely above stall speed. But he has perfect firing position on all 6 German aircraft. He chooses his targets carefully. The trailing aircraft first, the ones most likely to recover quickly and re-engage. His gun sight tracks across the last Messerschmitt in line. Range 200 yards, angle off 30 degrees, deflection shot requiring minimal lead. He squeezes the trigger. 6.50 caliber machine guns hammer for 2 seconds. The German aircraft staggers, streams smoke, then rolls inverted and dives toward the ground. 1 down. The second target is already braking left, trying to escape the killing zone. Tommy leads him slightly and fires again. Another burst, shorter this time. The Messerschmitt's canopy shatters. The aircraft spins out of control. 2 down. Tommy's airspeed is still dangerously low, but the Mustang's engine is producing full power now. He's beginning to accelerate downward, trading altitude for speed, regaining the energy he sacrificed. His airspeed climbs. 180 miles per hour, 220, 260. The remaining 4 German fighters have scattered, trying to reposition for individual attacks. But they've lost their formation integrity, their altitude advantage, and their element of surprise. What began as a coordinated attack by 6 experienced pilots has become a chaotic encounter where individual skill matters more than tactical position. The third Messerschmitt comes at Tommy head-on, gambling on a high-speed pass. Tommy accepts the challenge, but with calculated precision. He holds his fire until range closes to 300 yards, then triggers a concentrated burst directly into the German aircraft's engine. The Messerschmitt explodes in a burst of orange flame. 3 down. The 4th and 5th aircraft try to coordinate a scissors maneuver, forcing Tommy to choose between 2 threats. But Tommy doesn't choose. He climbs again, using his regained energy to force both Germans into defensive positions. When they separate, Trying to avoid a mid-air collision, he picks off the slower aircraft with a deflection shot that tears through its wing root. For down, the remaining 2 Messerschmitts break off and dive for home. Tommy doesn't pursue. He's low on ammunition and far from friendly territory. Instead, he climbs back toward the bomber formation, checking his fuel, scanning for additional threats. The entire engagement has lasted 93 seconds. When Tommy rejoins the formation, Major Gabreski's voice crackles over the radio. "Morrison, where the hell have you been?" Tommy keys his microphone and responds calmly. "Engaging bandits, sir." For confirmed, too probable. Silence on the radio. Then Gabreski's voice, different now. "Copy that, Morrison. Nice work." But Tommy knows the real test will come during the debriefing, when he has to explain exactly how he accomplished what should have been impossible. The intelligence debriefing at Bogstad lasts 3 hours. 2 officers question Tommy repeatedly about the engagement sequence, asking for precise details about timing, distances, altitudes, and German tactics. They want to understand how one American pilot destroyed 4 experienced German fighters in less than 2 minutes. Tommy describes his maneuver methodically: the deliberate energy bleed, the controlled stall, the reversal of conventional engagement geometry. He draws diagrams showing aircraft positions, explains the physics of his technique, provides mathematical calculations for energy states and turning radii. The intelligence officers take careful notes, but remain skeptical. The engagement seems too clean, too decisive, too contrary to established combat patterns. One officer suggests that Tommy may have encountered trainee pilots or aircraft with mechanical problems. Tommy doesn't argue. He provides gun camera footage, witness statements from bomber crews who observed the fight, and detailed damage assessments of his own aircraft. 3 bullet holes in the left wing, minor damage to the radio antenna, otherwise unharmed despite engaging 6 enemy fighters. Major Gabreski attends the final portion of the debriefing. He listens as Tommy explains the tactical principles behind his technique, then asks pointed questions about applicability and risks. Could the maneuver be repeated? What were its limitations? When would it be appropriate? Tommy responds honestly. The technique works only under specific conditions. The pilot must have altitude advantage at the start of the engagement. Enemy aircraft must be committed to high-speed attacks. Multiple escape routes must be available if the maneuver fails. Most importantly, it requires precise energy management and perfect timing. Gabreski asks for a demonstration. 3 days later, Tommy takes another pilot up to 15,000 feet and shows him the basic maneuver. The other pilot attempts to duplicate it and nearly enters an unrecoverable stall. He concludes that the technique is too dangerous for general use. But word spreads through the squadron. Other pilots ask Tommy to explain his method. Some dismiss it as lucky improvisation. Others recognize the underlying tactical principles and begin incorporating modified versions into their own flying. Lieutenant Robert Anderson, a veteran of North African campaigns, asks Tommy to teach him the energy management calculations. Anderson adapts the principles to conventional engagement scenarios, learning to manipulate his aircraft's energy state more precisely during standard maneuvers. Captain James Dalton requests training on controlled stall procedures. He doesn't plan to use Tommy's radical technique, but he wants to understand stall characteristics better for emergency situations. Within a month, 6 pilots in the 357th Fighter Group are using variations of Tommy's energy management principles. They don't call it the stall fight technique. That name would be too provocative for official reports. Instead, they refer to it as advanced energy tactics or unconventional maneuvering. The results become statistically significant. The squadron's loss rate drops by 23% over the following 2 months. Kill ratios improve from 2.1 to 1 to 3.7 to 1. Most importantly, American pilots are surviving initial engagements at higher rates, allowing them to accumulate the experience necessary for long-term survival. Major Gabreski files official reports describing these improvements, but doesn't specifically mention Tommy's technique. Military bureaucracy is conservative, suspicious of innovations that contradict established doctrine. Instead, Gabreski emphasizes improved training, better formation discipline, and enhanced tactical awareness. Colonel Hub Zemke, commanding officer of the 56th Fighter Group, visits Bogstad in November 1943 to observe the 357th's improved performance. He interviews pilots, reviews combat reports, and asks specifically about tactical innovations. Tommy demonstrates his technique during a training flight, with Colonel Zemke observing. Zemke watches the maneuver twice, asks technical questions, then requests copies of Tommy's energy management calculations. A week later, he authorizes modified training programs for his own squadrons. The technique spreads informally through the 8th Air Force. Pilots who've trained with Tommy carry the knowledge to other bases. Squadron commanders share advanced tactical procedures through unofficial channels. By early 1944, energy management principles are being taught in pre-combat briefings across England. German intelligence begins noticing changes in American fighter tactics. Captured Luftwaffe pilots report that American fighters are becoming more difficult to predict, more likely to survive initial engagements, more effective in defensive scenarios. German tactical manuals are updated to address irregular American maneuvering techniques. Tommy never receives official recognition for his innovation. Military regulations don't award medals for tactical developments, only for individual acts of valor. But his influence on fighter doctrine becomes measurable in lives saved and victories achieved. The quiet revolution in American fighter tactics helps establish air superiority over Europe by summer 1944, contributing to the success of D-Day operations and subsequent campaigns. The principles Tommy Morrison discovered during 93 seconds over the Netherlands became foundational to modern fighter doctrine, though his name disappeared from official histories. By 1945, energy management was being taught systematically in fighter training programs. Pilots learned to think in terms of energy states, angle management, and deliberate energy manipulation. The Korean War validated these concepts under different combat conditions. American pilots facing MiG-15s used energy fighting techniques to offset the MiG's superior climb rate and altitude performance. The same principles that worked against Messerschmitts proved effective against Soviet-designed aircraft. Vietnam War pilots inherited these tactical foundations through the Navy Fighter Weapons School, later known as Top Gun. The school's curriculum emphasized energy management, angles fighting, and tactical flexibility over pure aggression. Instructors taught students to think like Tommy Morrison, calculate first, react second. Modern fighter aircraft incorporate energy management principles into their design specifications. Fly-by-wire flight control systems automatically optimize energy utilization during combat maneuvers. Heads-up displays present energy information to pilots in real time, allowing tactical decisions based on precise energy state calculations. The F-22 Raptor and F-35 Lightning II represent the ultimate evolution of Tommy's insight that energy management trumps pure speed. These aircraft use advanced aerodynamics, vectored thrust, and computerized flight controls to manipulate energy states with mathematical precision. Fighter pilot training today begins with energy management theory. Student pilots learn to visualize combat as an equation where energy, position, and timing are variables that can be manipulated to achieve tactical advantage. They study the same physics Tommy discovered independently in 1943. The tactical revolution Tommy initiated with his suicide maneuver saved thousands of lives over subsequent decades. American fighter pilots survived combat at higher rates because they understood principles he formalized under fire. The technique itself proved too specialized for general use, but its underlying concepts became universal. German tactical analysis after the war acknowledged that American fighters became significantly more effective in late 1943, attributing this improvement to enhanced pilot training and tactical flexibility. German pilots learned to respect American fighters that previously had been considered predictable and vulnerable. Tommy Morrison flew 67 combat missions before the war ended, accumulating 9 confirmed victories and probably destroying several more aircraft that fell behind German lines where confirmation was impossible. He never used his radical stall fight technique again in combat, but he never needed to. Other pilots adapted his energy management principles to conventional tactics, making the extreme maneuver unnecessary. In March 1944, Tommy was promoted to captain and assigned to train replacement pilots arriving in England. He taught energy management theory, demonstrated controlled stall procedures, and helped establish the tactical training programs that reduced American fighter losses significantly. His students remember him as patient, methodical, and obsessed with mathematical precision. He required them to calculate energy states before attempting any maneuver. He taught them to think about combat as physics rather than instinct. Many credit him with keeping them alive during their subsequent combat tours. Tommy survived the war and returned to Amarillo in December 1945. He enrolled at Texas A&M University using GI Bill benefits, studying aeronautical engineering with focus on flight dynamics and control systems. His professors noted his unusual combination of theoretical knowledge and practical experience. He graduated in 1949 and accepted employment with North American Aviation, the company that manufactured the P-51 Mustang. He worked on advanced fighter design, contributing to early jet aircraft development programs. His colleagues knew he was a veteran but were unaware of his tactical innovations. Tommy married his college sweetheart in 1950. They raised 3 children in suburban Los Angeles. He coached Little League Baseball, taught his sons to build model airplanes, and rarely discussed his military service. Neighbors knew him as a quiet engineer who worked on classified projects and maintained a small workshop behind his garage. In 1967, a military historian researching fighter tactics contacted Tommy about his wartime experiences. Tommy provided technical information about energy management principles, but refused to be interviewed about specific combat engagements. He suggested the historian contact other veterans who might be more helpful. Tommy retired from North American Aviation in 1978 after contributing to F-86 Sabre development, early supersonic fighter programs, and advanced flight control systems. His final project involved computerized energy management systems that automatically optimized aircraft performance during combat maneuvers. He died in 1994 at age 70. His obituary in the Los Angeles Times mentioned his distinguished war service and aerospace career, but provided no details about his tactical innovations. The brief notice failed to mention that modern fighter doctrine incorporates principles he discovered during a desperate engagement over occupied Europe. At his funeral, 5 elderly men attended who had served in the 357th Fighter Group. They spoke quietly among themselves about missions they'd flown together, about techniques Tommy had taught them, about the mathematical approach to combat that had kept them alive. None of them mentioned the specific engagement where Tommy had developed his revolutionary technique. But they remembered. One of them, Robert Anderson, kept detailed notes from Tommy's informal training sessions. Anderson donated these notes to the Air Force Historical Research Agency in 1998. They're filed in the archives at Maxwell Air Force Base, rarely accessed, seldom referenced, but preserved as documentation of how tactical innovation occurs at the individual level. The notes include Tommy's original calculations for energy state manipulation, his diagrams of unconventional maneuver sequences, and his analysis of German tactical weaknesses. They represent one of the few surviving records of how a 19-year-old pilot from Texas changed fighter combat forever. Some innovations arrive with fanfare, celebrated by institutions, and recorded in official histories. Others emerge quietly from individual necessity, spread through informal networks, and become invisible foundations for future developments. Tommy Morrison's contribution to fighter aviation falls into the second category. He never sought recognition for his tactical discoveries. He never claimed credit for saving lives or changing doctrine. He simply solved a specific problem using mathematical principles and practical innovation. The problem was survival against superior numbers and experience. The solution was understanding that conventional wisdom isn't always wise, that doctrine has limitations, and that physics provides alternatives when tactics fail. Modern fighter pilots inherit Tommy's legacy every time they calculate energy states during combat training. They benefit from his insight that thinking clearly under pressure provides tactical advantages that pure aggression cannot achieve. They prove his central thesis: courage combined with intelligence changes outcomes. The sky above Europe is peaceful now. No formations of bombers struggling toward distant targets. No fighter aircraft climbing to intercept them. No young men making life-or-death decisions at 400 miles per hour. But the principles remain. In every cockpit where a pilot faces impossible odds and reaches for calculation instead of instinct. In every engagement where energy management trumps firepower. In every moment when understanding the machine provides options that doctrine doesn't recognize. Tommy Morrison proved that the line between possible and impossible often depends on someone willing to think differently, calculate precisely, and act on logic rather than convention. His 93 seconds over the Netherlands demonstrated that tactical innovation emerges from individual insight applied under extreme pressure. The Mocking stopped the day. He brought down 4 German fighters with a maneuver his instructors called suicide. The technique was never officially adopted, but its underlying principles became foundational to modern fighter doctrine. That's how wars are won, not through grand strategies alone, but through individual moments when one person calculates differently, acts on that calculation, survives, and in surviving demonstrates truths that change everything. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.